Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Guten Morgen. Bonjour. Buenos dias. Buongiorno. Welcome to our next session of technical training in bartender. Today, our bartender guru, Ian Cumming, will talk about bartender traceability. Well, I think most of you already know me. I'm David Parras. I'm the set director of Bartender Sigil Scientific for EMEA. And as I said before, today Ian will talk about traceability, but we will also talk about system database, integrated security, bartender document management through Librarian, History Explorer, and Reprint Console, and many other interesting things. So without further delays, I just hand over to Ian.
Bartender traceability. This is all about tracking the actions that are executed within the bartender software and the various features and functions that we make available for reviewing that recorded data. So looking at the agenda, as usual, we're first going to be going through a PowerPoint presentation where we go through the various aspects of what traceability is, how we're storing that data in the system database, the various applications involved, document management, so the traceability over the document design process, and of course the various traceability logs. So these are the various actions and events that are logged to the system database and elsewhere for later review. Then, of course, we'll go hands-on with the software, looking at that system database setup and the management of it, talking about and showing the service architecture, setting up the security so that we can secure the various aspects of the document design process, the traceability aspect in terms of what items are tracked and who can see that tracked information. Looking at document management, and of course with the various applications such as History Explorer and Reprint Console, examining the various logged information, the traceability logs that can be generated with Bartender. We'll mention quickly the APIs for programmatic capture or programmatic review of the information. And lastly, of course, as always, answering your various questions that come up during the presentation. So traceability, it's the effective and accurate traceability. Effective and accurate traceability is a key requirement of highly regulated industries in the supply chain. And of course, with Bartender being part of the supply chain, a key component of the applications and processes involved in the supply chain, it is important to have an accurate and reliable log of actions that have taken place for later review. So traceability for Bartender, what does that mean? Well, the purpose of traceability in the context of Bartender is to record a log of all actions that take place from design through to the production of printing labels. Such labels contain specific data in the form of text, barcode, and RFID. And of course, we want to capture that data for our traceability logs. The labels are then used, of course, to identify items that are then put into the supply chain, which in turn themselves are tracked through the remainder of the supply chain. So in Bartender, we have design workflow processes of the document that we want to trace to have visibility over that whole workflow, that whole process of designing and managing and using documents in the BarTender solution. And of course, a traceability logging of print jobs, messages, events, and other actions that occur within the software. And with that information logged and traced, we of course need to make that available to authenticated users who have permission so that they can manage and report on that recorded data. So why is traceability important? Well, in particular, for highly regulated industries and businesses, like those, for example, that adhere to FDA and EU regulations, it is often required to give proof as to the authenticity and robustness of the system's processes and workflows. And this, of course, includes the design process and the printing process in the case of BarTender. Why is this important? Well, of course, if something goes wrong, there needs to be accountability and evidence of the work that was produced, so that it can be used to help solve problems in the future, but also to act as a legal record of evidence, should that be required by authorities. A documented log of events during the label design and printing process is, of course, is a recording of the history of what has taken place, of who did what and when, and it needs to be, of course, secure and unchangeable. It needs to be trustworthy and reliable, and it needs to be in a state where it's readily available for access by the correct users. So in the case of perhaps the most well-known one within our industry, the FDA Title 21 CFR Part 11 is the part of Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations that establishes the FDA regulations on electronic records and electronic signatures. So if you can imagine, back in the day, back in history, before the advent of computers, all of these processes were logged and recorded using paper records. Of course, that was very slow and an arduous bureaucratic task, but then when computers came along, it made the recording of such bureaucratic information much more easy, much more accessible. However, with electronic records, it quickly became apparent that these things could be forged, they could be made up, and therefore strict rules were put in place to ensure that the electronic records that replaced the paper records were just as trustworthy and reliable as their paper equivalents. So it's all about reproducing what was an existing manual system with paper and putting it into the realm of computers and computer technology. So the purpose of that particular regulation is to produce with certainty, or the apparent certainty, of paper records into the digital realm, and therefore the purpose of it is so that the user and organization is to know how to use the computer system and software and to be aware when it isn't working properly, to maintain data safely and securely, and to ensure it is not corrupted or lost, so that approvals cannot be disputed, such as with electronic signatures and records. Changes to the data can always be traced, and falsifying of records are made difficult, and importantly, if made, can be detected. So it's all about ensuring the trustworthiness, the reliableness, the truthfulness of the traceability record. So first we'll look at the BarTender system database. So what is the system database and what is its purpose? Well, the BarTender system database is used for the purpose of storing bartender generated data. So it's not storing business data of the customer. It's only storing that data that is generated by the BarTender software itself. And related to this is the BarTender System Service, which is a Windows service which is used for performing the various database transactions, for inserting and updating records, and thereby keeping the BarTender application responsive. So its purpose is to perform those transactions where records are added or updated to the system database. It should be noted if the Enterprise edition is in use, then this data can be centralized into a single database. So this is a great advantage of the Enterprise edition. So you can have one system database among many BarTender users within your organization. Otherwise, if you have lower editions, of course, there will be some features that are missing, but also only a local database instance can be used for each BarTender client, and therefore it limits the visibility, the access of that recorded data to a much greater extent, as all of the recorded data will be then located on separate computers, as opposed to one centralized database. So for this purpose, the Enterprise Edition is very useful if traceability is a very important requirement for your customers. So what is it used for in terms of what is it storing? Well, it's used as the document repository for the managed librarian documents and other files. It can be used for storing the security configuration of the BarTender software. It can store what are called global data fields. These are universal values, variable values that can be stored in the database, and they're therefore shared between multiple BarTender documents, but also multiple BarTender users, as that particular data value, it's like a named data source, is stored in the system database as opposed to being stored in a document. And of course, in terms of traceability, it is used for storing the various logged information, including print job logs, application message logs, event logs from integration, security check logs, the various printer events and printer maestro events, which we'll look at later, and also related to printer maestro, inventory usage logs for the inventory tracking of consumable media in printer maestro. So these are all the items that are stored and used in that system database. As you can see, that's all BarTender generated data, no customer business data as such. So what do we use to store the system database? Well, as you can see, we use Microsoft's SQL Server. So the BarTender system database is hosted by a SQL Server instance. Yes, it has been requested in the past that we support other database engines, and certainly that is something we have often considered, though as yet we have yet to implement support for other database engines. So yeah, sorry, currently we're still limited to supporting only SQL Server. As part of the BarTender installer, we package currently SQL Server 2014 Express Edition. So that is packaged as part of the installer, but is not installed unless you actually choose to do so via the system database wizard. So what we have with the installer is that the BarTender installer is that we store the SQL Server installer for the Express edition in the program directory of BarTender, so that if a user runs the system database wizard and selects to install SQL Server Express edition, it will run in the background that SQL Server installer from Microsoft. But it is not mandatory. The system database is an optional component for customers. Therefore, the same is true for SQL Server. Of course, if you want the full traceability, as we'll see, as is offered by BarTender, you will need to install a system, or you will need to have a system database, and thereby you will need to have a SQL Server database server installed somewhere. As mentioned before, if it's the Enterprise Edition, that could be located on a different computer elsewhere on the network, a centralized database server. Otherwise, it needs to be on the same computer as the BarTender PC. Of course, customers don't have to use the packaged SQL Server that comes with BarTender. They can instead install their own copy of SQL Server of almost any version, but it needs, I think, to be of version 2005 or higher. And yes, they can make use of the latest version of SQL Server, which I think is SQL Server 2019, although I think it may be due for an update soon. Nevertheless, those newer versions are supported, and of course it can be of any edition. It does not have to be the Express edition. It can be a full edition of SQL Server. And as I mentioned, Enterprise Edition is used or is needed for a centralized SQL Server. So the system database setup. To access or to start this, you need to go to the administration console. So that's one of the applications of the BarTender software. Select the system database section, as you see there in the graphic below. And if not already connected to a system database instance, like you see in the screenshot, then you can click on the system database wizard, which you'll see there as a link in the top right-hand corner of that screenshot. And this will start a series of windows, a wizard or an assistant that steps you through the process of connecting the BarTender client software to the system database. When connecting, when running the wizard, you can at that time choose to run the installer package for SQL Server Express Edition if it was not installed as part of the BarTender installation process. Otherwise, you can either choose to connect to an existing system database, either on the same or different server, or you can create a new instance of a system database on an existing SQL server, be that local or remote. In the system database setup, as you can see, you can set up the level of message logging that you wish to perform, and we'll be looking at that later. You can choose to record integration messages. So if you're making use of the integration platform for automated label printing, you can choose to what level of message logging you wish to make. A word of warning there, because integrations by their very nature can have quite a high volume and a high frequency of message logging. It is sometimes best to only choose to log integration messages on failure, unless, of course, you're needing to fault find a particular issue. So generally, when in production, only set the integration messages so that we're recording any failures. Otherwise, you have a very high volume and a high disk utilization due to those integration messages. That's one thing we've seen from customers in the past. But again, we'll look at that a bit later as we go hands-on with the software. And lastly, you can configure a cache size so that should the connection to the system database go down, or because of volume transactions are getting queued, we can cache those transactions to a file, giving time for the system service to catch up, performing the actions with the SQL server. So by default, that's 1,000 megabytes, but you can reduce or increase that according to a customer's requirements. Next, print job logging. This is perhaps one of the most critical aspects of traceability when it comes to BarTender. People want to know and keep a track of what has printed in their system, particularly when it comes to production. Therefore, with BarTender's print job logging, we offer quite a high degree of information, which is all configurable, that can be logged to the system database. So of course, first step is to enable the logging to the system database. And the second step is to choose the amount of data to be logged. And in the case of images, the quality of the image of a printed label to be logged. You'll notice in the screenshot that in terms of the data that we're logging, it has to do with the reprint. So first, when you enable print job logging, it's logging standard print job information. But under the reprint section, we're logging additional items that allow us to have or to execute a very faithful reprinting. And this is a key feature of traceability, the ability to reprint. This logging allows us to have a very faithful reprinting of that print job. As such, it allows us to record all of the static and variable data of all objects used in the label design. It includes a copy of the document and any linked pictures as they were at time of print. So when I say a copy of the document, I'm referring to the BarTender BTW file, the document file itself, as it was at the time of print. so that if you then go back to reprint that label, it will reprint it as it was back at the time of that initial or original print job. Also, as we see there, lastly, we can also store a picture, an image of each label that is printed. And in fact, for purposes of reducing disk utilization, so that your system database does not get too big, you can choose whether you wish to have an image of the first or last, or both the first and last, or all of the labels printed within the print job. Of course, if you choose the option to record all labels that were printed, and you're printing thousands and thousands of labels, then that can result very quickly in a high disk utilization with the amount of data that's stored in the system database. We have a question there from one of our viewers. Which tables in the system database is holding which information? So they're wanting to know the anatomy of the system database as it comes to the tables. The reason for the question is that they have various tables, BT objects, BT substrings, BT object properties, and they're each holding millions of records. Even though they run a cleanup of the database, I guess they have a lot of data there and they want to maintain the size of the database so it doesn't get out of hand. Well, luckily for that, BarTender, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, does offer various features and functions that allow you to maintain the size of the database so it doesn't get too big, so the database does remain performant. And we'll go on to that in a bit. The database tables themselves, well, the system database is a very relational database as it comes to the tables. So there isn't one giant table where each record contains all the information of that particular print job or that logged entry. So it's not as simple as looking at particular records and deleting records, making use of the SQL Server Management Studio, for example. In fact, we recommend that you don't use such tools unless, of course, you know absolutely what you're doing. But for the purpose of the question there, that's not really something that is possible. And instead, you should use the built-in tools in BarTender. And we'll look at that in just one moment. Indeed, maintenance. So the next item down in the system database section, it allows you to keep the system database to a manageable and performance size. So therefore, we offer tools so you can periodically perform backups and purges of old logged data. When we say a backup, this is in effect exporting out old records to what's called a BAK file, a back file, which is a SQL Server backup file, as the name suggests. And what this does is it externalizes that old data, so it's no longer part of the active database. It puts it in a separate archive file, and therefore only more current records are part of the actual database itself. Of course, this leads into reviewing that data. So you'd only be able to review the data that's in the active database. But of course, backed up database data can be restored to other databases if elsewhere, perhaps if you like an offline database, so that should archived records need to be viewed at some point in the future, it can be done in that offline database fashion. As part of the maintenance schedule, you can specify how often the maintenance is to run, to specify the schedule, for example, daily or weekly, and if so, what day of the week and at what time, and the action to take. So based on how old the records are. So what is your archive policy in terms of how old the records have to be before you then archive them? And where do you archive them to in terms of a .back file? And should it be the case that there'll be a separate back file for each maintenance that takes place? And we do this by adding a date and time to the name of the archive, or perhaps you would prefer it to be appended to one giant archive file. That, of course, is down to the customer to decide. And of course, you can see there in the screenshot the status of when the next maintenance is to take place, or when the last one took place, and whether that was successful or not. We also have administrative tasks. So if you want to manually execute particular tasks, you can do so from this particular page in the administration console. For those who want to keep an eye on disk utilization, you can look on you can click on the View Database Size button, and this will open a chart, a pie chart that gives details on how much disk space is used for different purposes within the system database. Of course, you see the overall disk usage, but then it's broken down into the different parts, such as for the document repository, such as for print job logging, integration message logging, etc. You can also choose to manually run maintenance at that moment in time to back up and restore a database of the .bak file, and also to purge records should you need to purge all logging records from the database for some reason. Of course, to save space. We also have Printer Maestro events, and Printer Maestro, as we'll see, is an application for managing and administering your printers, and it can, as it performs and captures events from printers and print jobs sent to printers and inventory events, etc. It can be set to log this data to the BarTender system database. However, to do so, you need to access the events setup in the Printer Maestro application itself. So rather than configuring this in the administration console, perhaps for legacy reasons, you have to enable this in Printer Maestro application itself directly. So sometimes this is something that can be overlooked, and when you choose to view your logged data, you may not see any of your printer events, print job events from Printer Maestro, or the inventory events. So make sure you set that up via Printer Maestro. Also, we'll talk about Siegel Scientific print drivers, particularly for print job logging, as you might expect with printer drivers, but also for printer events. it is necessary that if we wish to detect such events, and the Printer Maestro app, the Printer Maestro Windows service is very instrumental in capturing these events because it is always actively listening as a background process for messages coming from our printer drivers. But our printer drivers need to be able to listen for messages being sent or being generated by the actual physical printer itself. And for this, you would need to go into the printer driver settings and enable status monitoring. Status monitoring allows us to capture event messages being generated by the printer hardware itself. Now, of course, this requires the printer itself to support such functionality. I guess that's a given. But also, as you see, we need to have our printer driver set on a printer port that is bidirectional, that can communicate both ways, both in terms of sending the print job to the printer, but also in terms of getting that print job status and verification back from the printer to the Windows PC running BarTender. You can configure the frequency of the polling, and we use a polling function for capturing that printer data. So we will poll, we will ask or query the printer every X amount of time to ask if there are any status messages or any print job verification messages that it wishes to pass to us. So it's an active communication method in that sense. We can also select and specify where printer status information is displayed. It can be in its own little status window, as you see there in the screenshot, or it can be displayed in applications like Printer Maestro, in Windows printer queues, etc. Of course, if you've enabled in Printer Maestro the tracking of these events, then of course these detected events that are made visible by the printer driver can be logged and tracked in the system database, which is of course very important. And this of course gives us visibility down to the printer hardware itself, because it's not always the case that what BarTender thinks has been printed or has happened is necessarily the case that what the printer knows has happened. Perhaps BarTender sent a print job to the printer, but then someone powered off the printer, so the print job was lost, or some other failure, of course. With all this covered, we'll take a quick look at the BarTender system architecture to see how all the component parts of BarTender fit together. And I believe we covered this in the previous presentation 2 weeks ago, but updated here to include BarTender system database as an interaction with the BarTender system architecture. You'll see with the BarTender system architecture that data sources and integration methods there at the bottom. The BarTender system can integrate with business systems. It can connect with various business databases, and it exposes a REST API for web apps. But of course, and in particular with the BarTender, in particular with the business databases, that does not refer to the BarTender system database. So over there on the right, we can see in terms of administration access and storage, we have access to the BarTender system, or at least parts of it, through web browser, namely through the print portal. But importantly for today's presentation, data generated by BarTender can be stored, but also viewed in the system database. Of course, we're also interacting, making use of and leveraging Windows Active Directory for security services. And when printing, we can make use of the full set of over 6,800 Siegel Scientific printer drivers. So just wanted to bring to mind that system database, the BarTender system database, is very much an important piece of the overall BarTender system architecture. So now let's take a look at security, which I mentioned a moment ago, how we're integrating Windows security into the BarTender software. So again, in the administration console, under the security section, the user would enable security for this computer. When they tick that particular checkbox, they have the choice of where they wish to store the security policy. So the security policy can be stored in a local file, in particular an XML configuration file that's stored in a hidden folder, in a hidden Windows folder under Program Data that requires local admin permissions in order to access. So a regular user cannot access, view, delete, or change such a file unless they are an administrator. Alternatively, that security policy can be stored in the system database itself. And this is particularly useful for enterprise customers who wish to centralize their system database for their document repository, for their traceability logging, but also so that all users can share easily the same security policy by virtue of the fact that they're connected to the system database. You also see there you can, for example, if you're making use of a file, you can back up the security policy and restore the backup security policy. So if you need to do that for security purposes, for redundancy purposes, failure purposes, you can make a backup of your security policy. And particularly if you're storing your security in a file, one way of propagating that security policy between your BarTender computers is that you configure your security policy once, you back up to file, and then all subsequent BarTender clients would restore that backup policy that you already created. Of course, if you're using the system database as a centralized system database, it makes that whole process of setting up each individual BarTender computer that much easier, much more straightforward. Lastly, with error handling, should the security policy not be available, such as the system database server going down, for example, you can specify whether the access is flat out denied to the user, or if you wish to use cached security policy settings, which will be stored in a cached method on each of the BarTender clients, thereby giving robustness of the security system. With security enabled, customer can set up their user permissions. And in BarTender, we're leveraging the Windows Active Directory of the Windows domain. Also, the local computer can be used as well. And with users and groups that can be added to the security policy, each of those can then have their own set of allow or deny permissions set for individual actions that can take place within the BarTender software. So as you'll see, we have quite a long list of protected actions that can occur in different aspects of the BarTender software. And for each of the users and groups that you add, you can specify allow or deny permissions. If neither of the checkboxes allow or deny are ticked, then this is the same as an implicit deny. So what I mean by that is if you have an intersection between groups and users, so for example, an individual user might be a member of a group, and you want that particular user to have some exceptions in terms of being allowed permissions over certain actions that members of the group are denied. In this way, you could set up your users so that certain actions have an implicit deny, so both checkboxes are unticked. But then for a particular user, you can explicitly allow that particular action. So although they would be a member of the group, and therefore by default they would be denied the action, you can then explicitly allow them permission for that action. It should be noted if you explicitly deny the action to the group, then that denial cannot be overridden by a specific or an explicit allow. And if you're unsure as to what a user or group has permission over, you can select that user or group and check for the effective permissions. And it will say whether the effective permissions for that user or group is either allowed or denied based on the intersection of the various permissions from the various users and groups that have been set up. You can also specify a particular user or group as to be the default template for permissions, so that as you add a new user or group, it will take on that template of allow or deny settings for each of the actions, which is a nice convenience. Moving on to logging as it pertains to security. So with the security enabled, it is often necessary to log the consequential security checks that take place. So of course, traceability is all about the visibility of actions that have been executed and what has taken place within the software. So the same goes for security as well. So as each user performs actions, we can choose to log those security check actions to the system database. And as we'll see later, we can see what information is logged as part of that process. And you can choose to check all or have none of them selected, or only certain actions that are of importance selected for the traceability log. Electronic signatures. The question first is, what is an electronic signature? Basically, it's a way of securing a particular action by challenging the user to authenticate themselves at time of performing that action. So as they go to save a document, for example, even if they have permission as a user or a group member to perform that action, with electronic signatures, if it is enabled for that particular action, the user will be presented with a login dialog where they have to authenticate with their credentials to prove that it is them who is performing the action and not someone else who has come along and has gained access to an unattended computer. So when someone's gone off to have something to eat or to the bathroom, they didn't lock their computer, it prevents unauthorized people performing actions pretending to be the person that is currently logged onto that computer. So electronic signatures are very important for particularly sensitive actions. These should not be overused because, of course, you would not want to be entering in your security credentials for each and every action you perform in the BarTender software. Only those actions that you require as part of your process to have full level of authentication. Document encryption. This is another aspect of security in the BarTender software. So it guards against unauthorized use of a document outside of the customer's network, and it enables the document to be encrypted on the fly or automatically. Basically, with document encryption, we can create multiple encryption keys, giving it a name and a comment, of course, a value, the password, so to speak, the key value. And that is used to encrypt the document using AES 256-bit encryption. So word of warning, if you lose your keys, if you delete your keys, and you are unable to recreate them, you will in effect be locked out of accessing that document. So you need to be careful with your encryption keys. And you'll notice that you can have multiple encryption keys. So if you have a policy of cycling through or creating new encryption keys every period of time, of course, you can then build up quite a collection of encryption keys, whether that's based on that time-based policy, or if you're using encryption keys for different purposes or departments. You'll notice that you can select one of the encryption keys to be used for actively encrypting documents when a document is saved. But of course, over a period of time, that can result in different documents being encrypted with different keys. And therefore, you retain your keys in order to be able to decrypt those older documents. We also have a document encryptor utility, and you'll see a link to it at the bottom of that screenshot, that allows you to view the encryption keys that are used on a particular document, not see the encryption key value, of course, that is still hidden. And you can manually choose to encrypt a document with a key, whether it's to encrypt it from scratch or to re-encrypt it with a different key. So that's a utility that allows you to perform those manual processes. Document encryption is very useful in work to prevent counterfeiting. So if you have a particular document design that has aspects of it that are difficult to reproduce, perhaps there's a customized check digit or something like this, then you can encrypt and secure that document so that if an unauthorized user takes that BarTender document file, the BTW file, outside of the organization and tries to use it for producing print jobs outside of that business, because the document is encrypted and the encryption keys are stored as part of the business's BarTender implementation, the outside use of those documents will be prevented. So it's great for anti-counterfeiting purposes. Now let's take a look at the various applications beyond what we saw with Administration Console that are involved in traceability. Of course, the first one, of course, is Administration Console. And the Administration Console is not just about the aspects of traceability. It covers various miscellaneous topics of the BarTender software in terms of managing and setting up and configuring the use of the BarTender software. As it comes to traceability, of course, it has to do with setting up the system database, what is to be logged, etc. Setting up the document management, which is the librarian system, which we'll be taking a look at later, and how it can be integrated with the print portal web application. Configuring the security, as we've just seen, setting permissions, electronic signatures, logging and encryption, and also licensing. Licensing, as we'll see a bit later, is a bit of a funny one, but yes, that also can be configured as part of the Administration Console. Looking at Librarian directly, this is the main application that is used to administer and manage documents that are stored in the system database repository. So for those documents that are managed and you wish to control the various revisions and to specify a state for that document. And we'll look at document management in just a bit. The librarian application presents, as you see in the screenshot, kind of like Windows Explorer. You have a virtualized file system of the repository that you can navigate through. Individual BarTender documents and file assets can be stored and managed in Librarian. So again, in the screenshot, you see BTW files, but also text files, perhaps images, whatever else can be stored in Librarian. You can set up customized workflows and rules and file states, etc. The repository for Librarian is, of course, the SQL Server using the system database, and we can specify the status of individual resources. And this is through the workflows and the file states. But we'll be going more into document management in just a bit. The other application, again to do document management, is new in BarTender 2021. And this is the Workflow Builder. And this is used for creating in a diagrammatic form the workflow of how a BarTender document can go through its particular life cycle from its initial creation through the design and approval process and on to production. You can set up the various states, approvals, and transitions. You can connect each state to define the workflow. It can set initial and publish properties for each file state. You can set security permissions on each of these to control who can progress the document through the workflow. And of course, you can set up email notifications so that as the file is going through the process, individual users are notified that they need to perhaps take action to form approvals, to view the document to see if it meets the requirements of the business. And of course, to validate the workflow before publishing to make sure that everything is configured correctly and is functional before being used in production. Print Portal. This is the web application of BarTender, which is ordinarily used for manual label printing processes where a user will select and print labels, but also offers various document management functions to view the history of documents, to approve or reject documents, to make visual comparison between different document revisions, and also to add comments to a document. So a limited set of functions can be executed in Print Portal. And of course, the beauty of Print Portal is that it is not necessary for the user to have BarTender installed on their particular PC. So they can perform these functions if BarTender is not necessarily something they would ordinarily use. So for example, a person in the quality assurance department who needs to make an approval, they can just jump on the website, examine the document, make their approval or rejection as the case may be, and move on with their day without needing to have full BarTender software installed on their computer. History Explorer. This is perhaps one of the more central applications when it comes to traceability. As the name suggests, History Explorer is essentially a database or record viewing application that allows the user to view the recorded log data that's stored in the system database. So that administrators and managers can track that logged data. And in the History Explorer, we can take a look at application messages, integration events, BarTender print jobs, perhaps the more important one, generic print jobs that are recorded by Printer Maestro, likewise printer events and inventory events, again through Printer Maestro, and also security checks. So who did what and when. This can all be viewed within the History Explorer application. Reprint console. This is sometimes confusing with the History Explorer because it does cover a very similar set of features. What I mean by this is that it's basically, again, a database viewing application that allows permitted users to view data that's stored in the system database. However, with the reprint console, this is more constrained. It's constrained that it's only viewing historical BarTender print jobs. And the purpose of the reprint console, as is the name suggests, is for the purpose of a user to select and reprint one of those historical print jobs. And when reprinting, they can either choose to reprint the entire print job, or as you can see in the screenshot, individual labels from within a print job. So for example, if there was a print job of 1,000 serialized labels and one of those labels was damaged or destroyed, a print operator or a quality assurance manager, for example, can open up the reprint console. It's not showing any of the other traceability information, so no sensitive data is presented apart from print jobs. And it allows that user to select that print job and then choose which labels to reprint. And when they're reprinting, they can choose to reprint as themselves or as someone else. So the person who generated the original print job, the person who's doing the reprinting can be different. And likewise, the reprinting of the print job can be sent to the same original printer or to a different printer if that is preferred. Perhaps the reason for reprinting is that there was a failure with the printer. Maybe the print head is damaged, for example, and therefore you can reprint to a functional working printer instead using the reprint console. It should be noted that when you reprint a historical print job, that reprinting is also logged. So any printing, be it from BarTender directly, through an automated process, or through reprinting, this is all logged to the system database for total visibility. Printer Maestro. So Printer Maestro is an application of the BarTender suite that allows administrators, particularly, and production managers to control their printer population. And this can be both local on the local machine, but also remotely over the network, and to do so from one centralized application. So as you see there in the screenshot, you have access and visibility on the various printers on different computers. You can see information about that particular printer, and you can then have access to various actions, such as to open up the properties, to look at the print queue, to perform various actions or queries on the printer. And then in the below panel, we can view logged information in terms of active jobs, recent jobs, printer events, and inventory usage. All of this data that's displayed in Printer Maestro, when enabled, can be set to record and track and log to the BarTender system database. And it's the Printer Maestro application and the Printer Maestro service, in particular the service that is capturing this data. The Printer Maestro application allows the user to view that data, but also you can use the History Explorer to then view the historical logged data from what has been generated by Printer Maestro. So the Printer Maestro application, I guess, is more for viewing as the current information, whereas History Explorer can be used to view the historical Printer Maestro logged data. Let's take a look at document management now. So tracking the document through its life cycle. So the librarian system, as mentioned, is BarTender's document management and revision control system that makes use of the system database for its data storage as its repository and provides functionality to the administrator for document designs, document design management and workflows as the document progresses through its life cycle. It provides a very secure environment to manage the entire document design process. And of course, with the the BarTender security, you can lock down access to the librarian and its various functions to only allowed users. It combines with, it combines with the security of BarTender, which leverages the Active Directory domain. And it can allow a document that's going through its lifecycle process to have a property of whether it's a production ready document. So as it gets to a workflow state that is deemed production ready, and for everything else to be either unmanaged or not production ready, and therefore not available for print operators to print as production labels. So the librarian very much enables the continued development of a document and for the easy handling of change requests, even on production files. So with the document lifecycle, it's all about having traceability and visibility over a document design and maintenance process, which is very important for certification of solution if it's being used in a highly regulated industry. So as part of the life cycle, a need would be identified, and therefore a document is created, designed, and improved. It then gets put into production where it's used, and at a later point it can then be reviewed if it needs to have a change request or change applied to it to modify or update the document. At that point, it would loop back to a creation file state where it goes through its design process again, its approval process, until it's then used in production once more. Alternatively, the document could be deprecated from use and put into an archive, so retired, still stored in the document repository, because of course at a later date it could be reintroduced, and also stored for purposes of traceability, to have the visibility of information on that document. So with the workflows, why do we have workflows? Well, it allows us to control the document creation, modification, and production process. With the workflow designer, we can create a workflow in diagrammatic form, which is very obvious and simple and straightforward to understand. You can see the connections between each file state and how it goes, how the document can progress from one file state to the next. And with the workflow designer, we allow any level of life cycle to be designed, from the very simple and linear, straightforward from design, review, and production, through to much more complex approval processes if they need to comply in more complex regulated industries in a much more complex business environment. This allows us to track and trace multiple document versions. It requires and gives review and approval before being available for production using the workflow, and therefore offers a full life cycle support, including seamless document updating and retirement, as we saw earlier. This is all about reducing errors, which is to save time, to save money, and of course to maintain the reputation of the business. If they have a very controlled process for their document designs, if it goes through approval steps, then we can make sure that the document is correct when it's put into production. The biggest fear of many customers is that they print many thousands of labels, stick them on many thousands of boxes or products, only to discover that there's a problem with the labels, and therefore product or logistical boxes need to be returned. That is something most customers, by all means, need to avoid. Now, in BarTender, we can have multiple workflows, and therefore to manage which workflow applies to which document, we have something called workflow rules. And a workflow rule allows us to specify which it allows us to specify which workflow will apply to which documents. So as you see there in the screenshot, you can specify by location of where the file is stored and by file type. So for example, a BTW or a BarTender document or some other type of file. Based on those two criteria, the rule can then specify which particular workflow will apply and automatically set itself on that particular document, so that as you, for example, save a BarTender document to, in this case, the librarian documents folder, it will then apply, in this case, the approval workflow. If instead you saved the document to a different folder, then perhaps a different workflow would apply. So maybe you would have different folders for different departments, for different document purposes, where different regulations or processes would apply to that document. Workflow rules allows you to differentiate between your files and to treat them differently in accordance to the workflow that you wish to use. Print Portal, as mentioned before, as seen before, has a part to play in this. It can perform a few different actions as it pertains to document management, such as approving or rejecting an approval request for a document design, to view the various document revisions, to compare those revisions, to view an image of a particular document, and to also add comments to the document. So I guess somewhat limited at present, but this is certainly an area that we are looking to expand upon in the future. Okay, traceability logging. Embedded revision logs. Now, this is something that's different from what is logged to the BarTender system database. An embedded revision log is an additional item that can be enabled in the BarTender software. And the purpose of it is to log each and every change that is made to the document at the object level. So whereas the librarian system will log just the save points between your different revisions, and you can add a comment for each of those save points and have a file state, etc. The embedded revision log gives a full list of each and every change that was made within the document itself. So if you moved the barcode from here to there, if you created a text object, if you resized a picture object. All of these changes are stored in the embedded revision log. Okay, we have some noisy outside. Apologies for that. I think it's street cleaners. Each revision log entry can have, so each time you save the document, you have an embedded revision log entry, and in each entry we can then have each of those object changes that were made to the document design. Each of those entries will have a save number, a date and time of when it was stored, and the user information. You can add optionally a comment with each save point, so you can store some comment about that saving of the label. And of course, you can then view that embedded revision log either in the BarTender Designer or from within the librarian application. So it's important to note that the embedded revision log is an additional item that can be used in concert with a librarian or as a simple replacement for librarian. The embedded revision log is supported by lower editions of BarTender. You don't need to have the enterprise edition for the embedded revision log. So it gives you a poor man's version of document management to a certain degree. It does not give you revision control though. We'll take a look at that a bit later. So when you're enabling the embedded revision log, you do so at the BarTender Designer application level by going to the BarTender document setup dialog under the administer menu item. Here you'll see you can enable the embedded revision log, and this enables it at the application level of BarTender. So therefore, with each document that you create or open with the BarTender Designer and you start making changes, those changes would be recorded in a revision log for that document. And you'll note you can also choose to save a comment at time of saving the label. So therefore, when you see in the diagram, let's say we create a barcode or move the barcode, resize it, perform a bunch of actions. Each of those actions are recorded so that when you save, making a comment, it builds up our revision log, which you can therefore see a revision of the log where you see the different saved versions, saved number of versions with date, time, user, and comment. And then for each of those save points, you'll see each of the individual actions that took place. And as stated previously, that revision log is saved and stored as part of the BarTender document file itself. So it's not stored in the system database. Unless, of course, you're storing the document in the system database using a librarian. Print job log. This is a log of the recorded print jobs, and typically you would use the History Explorer to view this. So you can view all of the print jobs that were generated by BarTender. And as you see there in the screenshot, you can see a list of records for each and every print job that was generated. You have an overall overview or summary page of that particular print job for documentational purposes. You can view the status history of the print job as it was created, generated, spooled, sent to the printer, and hopefully printed by the printer, which would then be verified by the printer if enabled. You can view the various messages, be they errors, warnings, or informational messages that were generated. Like with the reprint console, you can reprint the labels from within History Explorer. So you can reprint a historical print job, either the entire print job or an individual label or labels from the print job. And of course, as you see there, we can have a preview of the printed labels depending on which option you selected for your system database setup. Application messages. Again, this can be viewed in the History Explorer, and you can view all the various type of application messages that were generated by the various parts of the BarTender software, be that BarTender itself, system database, the licensing service, etc., etc. And you can filter this list of messages by application, by computer, by period of time to find just the information that you need. It should be noted that the integration messages are also recorded as part of this view of BarTender messages. And it also shows how we class those messages, whether they are errors, warnings, or informational messages. And you can click the buttons at the top to filter down which of those you want to see. So if you only want to see errors, for example, then you would select only that button to be displayed, to only display the errors that were generated. In the security check log, we can see all of the actions, all of the protected actions of BarTender that also had a tick checked for the logged item. And of course, for each of those actions that took place, we record the date and time of when the action executed, who the user was, to identify who it was, whether they made use of a login override or an electronic signature to help authenticate who it actually was at the moment of performing the action, which application was involved, the particular permission or action requested, and the result of whether it was allowed or disallowed. So it's very easy to see who has been trying to perform actions that were disallowed to that user. So an administrator can very easily go to that person and ask, why is it they're trying to perform actions that they're not allowed to perform? Is it because they're doing or trying to do something that is not permitted? Or is it because perhaps permissions need to be adjusted so that the person can properly do their job? In the Printer Maestro logs, again, this can be viewed in the History Explorer, provided that those Printer Maestro events are logged to the system database. And remember to enable that in the Printer Maestro application itself. In terms of print jobs, this will log all print jobs within the Windows system. So it's not just limited to BarTender print jobs, but it will also record print jobs generated by other software within the computer, or within the scope of what Printer Maestro is monitoring. As you can see, it gives details of the history of that print job and also an overview page of that print job and any events that occurred within that print job. Licensing. As mentioned previously, this is somewhat different, because with licensing, we are able to record for tracking purposes information about the printers that have been used, electronic documents that have been used in terms of licensing of electronic documents, and also activity of individual users over a period of time. All of this information is stored and logged in a separate database, which is managed by the license server component of BarTender. It is not actually stored in the BarTender system database itself. You can access this information in the administration console, and we'll take a look at that in just a short while. But it's important to note that this is not system database recorded information. This is recorded information as part of the license server component of BarTender. Programmatic APIs. For those customers who are wishing to build software that can perform traceability functions, they can make use of our .NET APIs. This applies to the librarian system for document management, and also for the system database in terms of querying the logged data. So from the librarian API, this is ideal for bespoke software solutions that wish to incorporate BarTender's document management system seamlessly into the application. So rather than the user performing those document management tasks in Librarian, they can do this instead from within the bespoke software through virtue of the Librarian API. For the System Database API, this is the recommended and official method for extracting the logged data that is stored in the system database for the purpose of a transactional query, or if you're wishing to produce reports. Now, of course, it is possible, because the system database is a SQL Server database after all, for a reporting application such as Crystal Reports to connect to that SQL Server database and extract that information and put it into some sort of report format. However, the structure of the system database is relatively complex and highly relational, making that process somewhat difficult if you were to take that approach. And also, between versions of BarTender, we cannot guarantee that we won't change the schema or the structure of the database. And therefore, the recommended and supported process for generating reports is to make use of the System Database API to extract that data and to put it into a report format. It should be noted that the History Explorer itself does offer some limited report capability, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. Okay, so we've looked at traceability as it is in BarTender, but just to finish off, what about traceability and verification of printed labels? So the print job log in BarTender records details of what BarTender has requested and thus believes what has printed, but it does not confirm that this is indeed what has printed. For a level of validation and verification, and for that level, you need an integrated vision-based hardware system. That sort of system is required. So a hardware-based vision system that integrates with the printer. So typically connecting to an AUX or GPIO port of the printer. This would normally sit in front of the printer, scanning the labels as labels are printed and come out of the printer. And it can perform various tasks, such as barcode validation of data and a compliance verification of the quality and grade of that barcode. So validation and verification, these are two terms that are often confused. Validation has to do with ensuring that the data printed on the label is the data that is expected for that item. So is the data that are printed that will be stuck on a particular box or product, is that data applicable to that particular box or product? Is that the correct data? Whereas verification has to do with the quality of the printing, quality of the barcodes, quality of the overall label, and whether it fits the criteria specified. More advanced verification and validation systems can use a vision system of the label that is printed as a whole. So not just the barcodes, it's not just a barcode scanner, it is a label scanner. These vision systems will allow you to define the criteria of the label layout, including barcodes, so that can then be validated and verified to make sure that text and barcodes and pictures and whatever information as is expected is indeed what has printed. And also if there is a blemish mark, for example, if there was a ribbon crease on the printer and this caused a black diagonal mark through the label design, you can have vision systems that check for such blemishes so that if there's printed or marks of ink on the unprinted areas of the label, that can be validated or verified, should we say, and the label marked as bad if it does not pass the blemish check or the quality of printed label check. And there are various hardware-based vision systems out there that are compatible with BarTender. So you have the LVS, I think it's the label vision system from Omron, which used to be known as Microscan, and also the Perceptor PTXL system from Intervision Global. And these two in particular offer a very high quality vision-based system for verification and validation of printed labels. And certainly we're keen to work with such systems in an improved way with BarTender as we go into the future. And there are many other systems out there that can also be used with BarTender, but those two in particular are of very high quality. So let's go hands-on with the software. And of course, if anyone has any questions on what's been covered so far, then please feel free to add them to the questions in the GoToMeeting software. So let's first look at the administration console. So as mentioned previously, the administration console not only has to do with the traceability within the BarTender software, but also various other aspects of BarTender management. For us though, we will first go to the system database section where we can see that I'm currently connected to my system database instance. The schema version is 1.8, which is the schema version used by BarTender 2021. In the previous version of BarTender 2019, it was an earlier version of the schema. So as you upgrade the BarTender software, it also changes the schema, the structure of the system database accordingly. Because of course we change and add to the amount of information that we can record and what BarTender can be generating in the software. Someone's asked, how can we connect LVS to the BarTender system? I think that'll have to be a question for another day, because that would be quite a complex answer, which I don't readily have the information to hand. So I'll have to pass on that particular question. But that's certainly something that as could be a new topic for a new webinar at some point in the future, how BarTender can be used effectively with such vision-based systems. At present, it's not tightly integrated, so there's a fair amount of manual process that would be involved. But as mentioned, BarTender is compatible with such systems. Okay, back to Administration Console. If I click on the System Database Wizard, it will step me through the process of connecting to my system database. Here we have two options: to create a local system database with default settings, or to customize connection settings. It should be noted, if you select this one, I believe it's the case that that will result in the Express edition of SQL Server being installed if it is not already done so. Therefore, if you already have SQL Server installed, or if you have a system database already created and you wish to connect to it, then choose the second option. Here you would then be prompted to specify where your server is located. In my case, it's on my local machine on a database server called BarTender. And I can make use of either Windows or SQL Server authentication, depending on what you have enabled. The default, of course, is to use the Windows authentication. When I come to the next dialog, I can see that there's already in existence a system database called Data Store on my particular SQL server. But if I wanted to, I could create a new instance of a database on that SQL server. In this case, if you don't mind, I will just simply select to connect to the existing system database. Voila, bang, we're connected. Question, can I do a rollout of the system database settings to all of my clients? That is a good question. I believe it's the case, particularly if you're using the silent install method of BarTender installation, that you can specify, I might be wrong here, I'm not sure. I think you can specify the connection to the system database as part of the silent install. Otherwise, particularly if it's a centralized system database, then you would run the wizard to set up the user to connect to that already existing system database. Of course, if you have security enabled, so here we can see security is enabled on my computer, and rather than using a local configuration file, I choose to use the security settings as stored in the system database. When the user connects to that system database, they will automatically take on the security settings as is already stored in that system database. Hopefully I answered that question. I guess we'll need to confirm, perhaps one of my colleagues can confirm while we're in the session as to how one would roll out the system database settings, perhaps in a more automated way, rather than needing each user to run the system database wizard. I have a feeling there's a support center article out there somewhere on this very subject. Okay, moving on. With the system database, as you can see, when it's connected, we can then choose the level of message logging that we wish to perform. As I mentioned earlier, integration message logging is one item you need to keep an eye on, particularly for high volume automated printing, because the number of messages that can be generated can be quite huge, can be very big. So perhaps when in production, you would only choose to log failed integration events only, and only open that up should you then come across a problem and you wish to debug it in greater detail. Print job logging, as we saw earlier, you can choose the various options there for the amount of data that you want to log to the system database. And images of printed items, this in particular is an important one because it can result in high disk utilization depending on your print job volume. You'll notice that we can log a printed image of all first only, first and last only of printed labels. So I would, unless your volume is quite low, I would select, my recommendation would be the first and last only. And you could choose an image type. I choose PDF. PNG perhaps might be another option. And the amount of colors. As in our world, we're typically printing barcode labels. Perhaps you don't need a full true color picture of your label, and therefore 256 colors will do. Again, that will save disk space. As we take a look at disk utilization in just a moment, you'll see how that can work out. Under system database maintenance, this is where you can specify your schedule, where you're backing up your old archive records. And by default, we put them to this hidden Windows folder in program data, but you can move that to somewhere else if you prefer. And we can see the last time and next time when maintenance will be performed. Under administrative tasks, we can perform those various actions, but the one I like to see is to view the database size to see that utilization. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So here we can see what is taking up the lion's share of my particular system database. And it should be noted that my database, of course, is not a production database. It's just a database that's used on my laptop as part of my job performing training and working with customers on their projects. So my disk utilization is probably very different from one used in production. So let's see, librarian data, yes. Ordinarily, this section would be relatively smaller, certainly compared to the print job and application message logs. But on my PC, the amount of data stored for the document repository is quite big, but it's not huge. It's only 15 megabytes, as we can see. Printed items, the item in green, this is the picture of each individual label. This section can get quite big, as can various other application messages and print job data. So we can see the overall amount of size and how that splits up. And from that, you can then make changes to what data is logged, depending on what you need and how much disk space you have available to you. And you can decide what records that need to be backed up, etc. Typically, though, it's the log files, the print job log, the application message log, and the integration logs that take up the lion's share of the system database utilization. Have a question here. Windows authentication. Let's go to security. Windows authentication is the default. Is there no way to select mixed during the installation wizard? Is there a reason to activate mixed mode authentication? I guess this may have to do with the system database, perhaps, because with the system database, as we saw in the wizard, you can connect to a system database using the Windows authentication, so the Windows account of the logged in user, or SQL Server authentication. So this is a credential system that's hosted by the SQL Server itself. And we support both. So both can be used, and depending on what component it is, you can specify whether that component makes use of SQL Server authentication or the standard Windows authentication. I'm not sure if that answers your question there. Hopefully it does. If you have follow-up, then please feel free to add an additional comment. So under security, when you enable the security, we can choose where that security policy is stored, and you can back up and restore that policy for security purposes. And we can specify how we handle error handling should the security policy not be accessible for whatever reason. So I'm just looking at questions here. Okay. So with that enabled, this takes us on to the security and user permissions. So as we can see, we can have different users and groups, and these then are set with different allow or deny permissions over the various actions within the BarTender software. As you see, we have quite a few of these actions. If you're making use of document management, for example, you'll notice that we distinguish between printing published documents and unpublished documents. Published document is a document that is managed by the librarian system, and that document has reached a file state that is deemed to be production ready and therefore published. All other documents, so if it's a managed document revision that has not yet been published, or if it's a document that is unmanaged, i.e. not stored in librarian, then these are seen as unpublished documents. And in this way, that integration, that intersection between the security and document management allows you to specify, particularly for your production print operators, it allows you to secure and specify that they can only print those production documents, those published documents that they are allowed to print for production. And that in the context of production, such print operators cannot print unmanaged documents or revisions of documents that have yet to be approved. So very much ensures that production of label printing is only of those labels that the business wants to be printed for production. So the integration or the intersection of security with document management allows you to accomplish this task. If I select myself as a user or group, I can right-click on this and choose to perform various actions, such as setting that particular user group as the template for all new users or groups that are added. So for example, if I add another user, this can come from the domain or from local. Let's see if I can add my colleague David here. David Paras, welcome. You'll notice that these permissions are equal to what I set as my template of Ian Cummings. So that's a nice quick convenience that you can set up if you want different users or groups that have more or less the same permissions as an existing one. We can also, let's say if I select the local user, I can also select to view the effective permissions of that user or group. And this will present to me a dialog of the effective permissions, allow, deny permissions over the various actions within the software. So if you're unsure about the interplay between users and groups, where a user might be a member of an existing group, and therefore how those two competing sets of permissions interact, you can check the effective permission for that user or group to see what exactly they are permitted to do or not, like so. Of course, for each of these actions, we can choose to log them. In my example, I'm logging all of them. Actually, before I forget, sorry, David, permission revoked.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can log all our security actions. Electronic signatures, by contrast, primarily you would leave most of these blank. Only particular sensitive actions, for example, to save a document, or perhaps in production to make a document published. Only those particular actions you might want to have an electronic signature. With document encryption, here I can see that I've specified a couple of different encryption keys with a hidden key value, which was defined at time of creation. So for example, if I add a new one, call this test, for example, the encryption key, when you enter it, is in the clear, so it can be any key like so. Try to make it of a secure length and value. And make a comment. And with that encryption key generated, it can be then used for encrypting documents automatically. And we can choose which of the encryption keys we wish to make as the current encryption key for securing our documents. At this time, though, I will not enable that. And you'll notice that if I open up the properties of an encryption key, that key value, that password, shall we say, is now locked, although you can view it. Can you view it? You can view it if you have permission, I guess. But by default, it's hidden from view. Of course, to actually access this function, you would need to have user permission to do so. So for the administration console security, that can be locked down to only certain users to prevent unauthorized access to these things. Let's apply that. And if we open a document or create a new document in the BarTender Designer, and I'll save that to my desktop. This is a very simple document design, as you can see. The classic sample text label design. This document has now been encrypted with my development key. And I can check that by opening up the document encryptor utility. But with that utility, I would be able to view the encrypted security of that document to see which key had been used to encrypt the document, and indeed if I want to re-encrypt it with a different key. Seems that my PC is playing up on me. Okay, not to matter. Let's now move on to History Explorer, where we can, of course, view our logged information. Now, by default, what we see in History Explorer would typically, well, perhaps not by default, but typically what most people want to see is the print job log. And in History Explorer, we can view the print job log, the messages, Printer Maestro events, the security log, etc. Up above, we have the individual records, and we can expand one of these records to see the status history and any messages that were generated from that log, from that logged print job. Beneath, we can see a summary page, which would be for good documentational archive purposes for that particular print job, should the customer need that level of bureaucratic documentation. We can see the status history from the print job being created, queued, and then sent. And of course, if printer status monitoring is enabled, we can then verify that the print job was printed. It's a bit tricky for me at the moment because I'm working from home, of course, and therefore I don't happen to have a barcode printer placed on my desk at home. Perhaps, David, you can get something sent to me. Or maybe not. We can also see any messages that were generated from the job. So as you see here, there was a warning on this particular job where an item was clipped because it wasn't fully placed on the label design. But it's just a warning. It doesn't prevent the print job. It just meant that that line didn't print in its entirety. And we can also, from the History Explorer, we can choose to reprint either the entire print job or individual labels from that print job. And yes, I can already hear it. Yes, this does reproduce exactly what the reprint console does. But the History Explorer application is for use by system administrators, for production managers, so on and so forth. So for more higher level and administrative personnel. Whereas the reprint console is an application that's dedicated to just reprinting of historical print jobs. It's not showing any of this other recorded information. So the reprint console is more usable for the more operational staff. So perhaps senior print operators or someone else in the production environment who needs to reprint what was a damaged or unreadable label that they wish to reprint. So a bit of duplication there, but it's important that the History Explorer can also perform that function from the administrative level. Okay, let's produce a print job. So let's open an existing label design. Not my document one, something a little more interesting perhaps. So if I go to my BarTender documents, I think in this folder here, let's see what's in manufacturing, not manufacturing. Good old logistics. I think some of these are older label designs, to be honest. Let's select this one here. So here we have our document design. We can choose the printer that we wish to print to. So let's choose printer B, for example. And number of copies. This is a label that's connected to a data file, so it depends how many records are in that data file as to how many labels will print. Produce a print job. And you'll notice that when we produce that print job, let's do that again, we can see this window here is indicating that we're logging and generating images of that print job. Switch back to the History Explorer. And in History Explorer, it is not immediately up to date. We can, in History Explorer, under User Preferences, under the General tab, we can specify how often or how frequently we refresh the page to reread any new records that have been added. I think the default is 30 seconds, and I've changed that to 10 seconds at some point in the past. Perhaps you'll need to check to see what it is on yours. But if you need to update immediately, just hit the refresh button. Scroll to the top, and here we can see our print job that was produced. Now, because we're only taking an image of the first and last label printed and storing that in the system database, the labels in between have to be dynamically generated. It took a bit of time on my PC because, again, I got so much going on my PC at the moment. I think my PC is somewhat struggling. But if I go to the end one, of course, because it's a logged item, that is presented immediately. If I wish, I can click on this icon here to view that item as it is a PDF in a PDF application. So I can view that as a separate file as a PDF. And of course, I can then choose to save that as a standalone PDF file if I need that particular purpose. Let's take a look at messages. As we can see, we log all the various messages, application messages that can occur in BarTender. This includes in the BarTender suite, should I say. This includes BarTender itself, but also licensing, also the integration service. And, yes, we have some integration service items here as well. So of course, in a fully automated production environment with high volume automated printing, if you're not careful, again, word of warning, you could very quickly fill up your application message log with endless integration service events. So you need to be careful with that. Of course, we can check the time span. So maybe limit it to just the last 24 hours or last 30 days, or in this case, all. And I think there was a question earlier about asking how much in terms of period of time of data is recorded. Well, with the Enterprise Edition, there is no end time. We record all. Of course, when you perform a maintenance on your database, some of those older records can be backed up to a separate file so that your system database itself is kept reasonably compact and therefore performant. But strictly speaking, there is no limit for the Enterprise Edition. For the lower editions, so Automation Edition down, it's limited to 7 days of logging. So if traceability is important to yourself and you need ready access to a longer period of time of traceability, then you really will need the Enterprise Edition for that. Printer Maestro. Actually, on the messages, you'll notice that I can turn off and on the various severity of the messages, whether that's warning, errors, or informational messages. So that helps me to filter down. And we can also view those messages by different application or by computer, or we can customize our view. So we can filter by the various criteria that we wish to specify, and then apply the filter. The information logged, be that application messages or print jobs, for example, we can then export that as a view. So if you choose that option, we are presented with a view of the recorded data in a much more tabular fashion. So some level of simple report, so to speak. I'm not going to claim it's a highly sophisticated report structure, but it allows us to see that in an external form, external to the BarTender software. But you can, via these icons, form various items which change the way the report looks, but also we can export either sending as an email or exporting as a file. And of course, that's probably the most useful. So you could export that, for example, as a CSV file, and that CSV file could then be brought into a database or used by a reporting application in some way in order to generate a more attractive looking report. So you can choose your CSV report options. So this is a text format in record of records, delimited in some way, such as with a comma, and that can then be imported by other software as a data source. So reporting is possible, producing reports is possible in the BarTender software without the need to necessarily make use of the API. A new question here: is it possible to add the variable data to the report. Not using the function I just showed you. Is it possible with the system database API? It's a good question. I'm thinking not at this time. I think that is a requested feature, but I think with the system database API for for producing a report and getting data from the system database using that recommended method, I think I probably need to confirm this looking at the documentation, but I think it does not allow you to get the labeled data. I think that was one of the limitations we have there currently, but we would need to confirm. It does actually present it in the help system, but I would need to drill into that and study before I could give you a definite answer. Printer Maestro, of course, we can record events there, and we can see events there because when I've come to the Printer Maestro application itself, let's just minimize this. In the Printer Maestro application itself, we can enable our events setup for where we're recording our message targets. We can enable this to record these events to the BarTender system database. We can also have a target for email and for the Windows event log as well if we wish. But for the purposes of traceability, using data stored in the system database, and to view that information in the History Explorer, you'd want to enable that for the system database, like so. And I've just enabled everything there. So, for example, let's take this printer here, and I'll right-click on it to access its properties, like so. And this opens up the printer driver instance for that printer that listed there in Printer Maestro. And you'll notice that this is a wonderful high-quality printer driver from Siegel Scientific. Very much recommended if we have a driver for the printer model in use. Under the tools, though, you'll notice that status monitoring currently is disabled. And this may be the case for yourselves as well if the port that you have specified is not a real port. So for example, on my local machine, because I'm not in production, I'm using BarTender for development and training purposes. I don't actually have a physical printer on which I do production printing with. So I've created a fake null port so that when I send print jobs, it just disappears into space. But if I want to have status monitoring enabled, I need to choose a port type that supports that bi-directional communication. So I'll just select this equally fake IP address port. Click on apply. So I'm now using that port, and you can see that has updated in Printer Maestro. Come back to tools, and now we can see that status monitoring is indeed enabled. Click on that, and I can choose the frequency of my status monitoring. If I want to display any windows or wherever else that information will be presented. So here's my little display window. Now, because I don't have a printer actually connected, after a short time, it's going to time out and say it's offline. So take a look for that. I can also say job verification. So if I want to verify individual print jobs that were sent to the printer to get just that little bit more verification that the printer is indeed printing our labels, we can enable this in our status monitoring. And you'll notice now that printer status is defined as being offline because I don't actually have a physical printer present on that IP address. Also, you'll notice in Printer Maestro, bang, offline. So if we come to printer events, you'll notice that each of those actions, whether it's to print a print job, to change the port of our printer, and indeed when the printer goes offline, because we enabled status monitoring to a non-existent printer, each of those events were recorded and are displayed in the Printer Maestro application. And because we've enabled in our events setup to log those events to the system database, indeed, it should be the case, and this is where I cross my fingers, when we come to History Explorer, this one, and go to all printer events, we can indeed see that those printer events have been logged and are visible in the History Explorer for the admin person, the production manager, whoever it is who's responsible to view and see these things happening. Now, of course, if a printer goes offline or it's a head failure, for example, error message, we could also specify an event target so that an email is sent. So maybe you would want to send an email for when there's a print head failure, for example, and send that to the printer or network admin so that they are able to take corrective action in a convenient period of time. So this gives us all the traceability, not just over the BarTender stuff, but also the printer stuff. And what I mean by printer stuff is that, yes, it includes everything printer and BarTender related, but also Printer Maestro events can actually include events that occur in non-BarTender software. Now let's test this, shall we? So let's open up Notepad. Hello, David. And choose to print. What am I going to print to? I'm going to print to my HP LaserJet, which doesn't exist either. Hopefully this works. Yes, it does. So this is a non-BarTender print job, but this is equally detected by Printer Maestro. And we can see that that print job produced by Notepad is logged as well. So it's not just limited when it comes to Printer Maestro, not just limited to BarTender events, which is nice. So it's a nice extra feature in terms of printer management. As you see here, we got the security permission checks where we can see who has been doing what and when. Of course, on my laptop, it's all about me with the occasional system being used. When you'll see the system, this is typically when it's as part of an automated process, perhaps through the integration service, the integration platform. I don't think I've done too much integration stuff recently, which is why there's not much integration security checks that's occurred. But when you see the system, that's typically where that is coming from. And indeed, if I were to open my services window of the Windows operating system, here we can see all the various Windows services. The BarTender ones are all prefixed with BarTender, with the exception of Printer Maestro. Of course, Printer Maestro has to be different. But otherwise, they all have BarTender prefixed in the name to make it easier to find them. And you'll notice that the integration service and all the other BarTender services are using by default the local system account. And this is why when you're viewing the security log, some of these will be the system account, that is the user. So just that to be borne in mind. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance and hopefully your attention. I hope to you.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, thank you, everybody, for attending today. And see you soon. See you in 2 weeks' time. That could be our last training of this series of training for this year. For sure, it could be more at the end of this year with the new stuff that we will bring you by that time. But well, we will finish at the beginning of July. So next, in 2 weeks' time, could be the last one. Thank you, everybody.